Welcome to Chandwell. My name's Michael, and I'm building this N-scale model of a run-down West Yorkshire town set in 1993. The River Chander finally has a building to reflect in its dirty waters. But what exactly is so special about this building? What is the story it has to tell? And what exactly makes this model so unique? Since starting Chandwell almost 4 years ago, I've learnt so much about the architecture of Yorkshire and all of the stories that it can tell. I've become captivated by the story of the textile mill's dye-drying works. These once common buildings in mill towns across the north of England are now nothing more than a forgotten curiosity. Early dye used to colour the cloth was very volatile and it needed special treatment in order for it to dry safely. So the Victorians built these exuberant buildings for just that purpose. They were very shallow and they had large central ventilation tunnels, specially designed with the right proportions in mind to ensure a correct draft no matter what the weather. Basement tanks were used to collect the runoff for later reuse, and this gave the buildings a fattened appearance underneath the ground floor. Progress in dye manufacture was rapid, and soon the need for the dye drying works was gone. And due to their unusual dimensions, every single one of them was demolished. I've got some pages of the Engineer magazine here dated the 1st of April 1888 because I'm interested in Ilkley Viaduct. I was delighted, however, when I found on the second page a picture of a dye drying works in Bradford. This picture immediately inspired me to make one for Chandwell. I like to imagine that the dye drying works of one mill in Chandwell is the only one to have ever survived to 1993. Obviously, it would be in a terrible state of disrepair. Maybe it was an electrical works in the 1960s. Maybe the Visit Chandwell Tourist Board are doing their best to save the building, complete with banner and one of those fundraising thermometer things that never seems to get filled up to the top. But back to the Engineer there. Let's have a look at this picture, because it reminded me of something. I realised that I could probably use some junk from around the house to give me a head start on the build. So here I have an old cassette, and by sheer luck, its dimensions are exactly right to represent an N-scale dye-drying works. By some remarkable coincidence, my friend and expert modeller Adrian is also making a really unusual building. When I told him about the dye-drying works, he told me about the LNWR's turntable observation towers. The turntable observation towers were built by the LNWR between 1899 and 1903. Based on an image as rare as mine, Adrian found that a single UK 3-pin plug just happened to be the exact dimensions to represent this largely unknown and similarly once prolific architectural wonder. Let's make a start. I measured the cassette with a ruler and drew a suitably sized elevation in the free application Inkscape. I printed the top part as a line drawing onto sticky label, which I stuck to 0.5mm card before cutting it out. A quick check of the dimensions showed that I was on the right lines. I carefully cut around the curved windows and was soon left with 2 layers which could be glued back to back with PVA. Starting with the back face, I added the really thin side walls. These dye drying works really were very shallow. I assume it's got something to do with getting the right amount of draft through the ventilation tunnels, but sadly there's not much evidence to back that up. Because I know that 2 layers of 0.5mm card is generally 1.4mm thick, the pieces I added resulted in a perfect fit for the dimensions of the cassette. I think that Adrian found that his measurements were also just right when he started to add the walls to his plug, using serial packet card backed with Scale Scene's brick texture. After some more measuring, I also used Scale Scene's texture to give me a convincing enough rear elevation of the works. I cut this with my scalpel. To easily cut holes, I crisscrossed the hole with scalpel cuts, and then carefully removed the resulting wedges. Before covering the cassette with texture, I painted the parts that would be exposed with acrylic paint, and I painted around the exposed paper edges too, to remove the white edge. I used PVA glue to position the building's top into place on the texture sheet. The PVA stays wet for a few seconds, and this allows me to smooth it into exactly the right position. A quick check for alignment, and it was time to fix the texture to the cassette. I don't like using Uhu generally, I do prefer PVA, but on this occasion I didn't know if PVA would do the job, so I covered the cassette in Uhu, and then smoothed the rear of the building into place. If you watch my videos regularly, you will know that I slice the texture across the window apertures and then tightly wrap the wall texture around the edges, ready for the windows. I cut strips of texture just 1.8mm wide to cover the edges of the wide part of the cassette. This represents the bulge that contained the dye reclamation tanks in the real thing. These smoothed on nicely and they look okay, I think. I'd normally recess my doors and windows, but here they are on the face of the cassette, and I had to add stone surrounds using 1mm card with the edges coloured with a watercolour pencil. I made window frames from sticky labels and acetate in my usual sticky label method approach. This sees me crisscross the windows with cuts, peel out the glazed parts, and then colour the resulting frames with really watery watercolour paint. Because of the shallow nature of the building, and because I had two sets of windows facing each other, I decided to represent interior grime to obscure the emptiness of the building. I used AK Interactive matte varnish mixed with a small amount of watery black watercolour and painted it on the back of the windows. This has resulted in a lovely grimy appearance to the upstairs windows. I used the sticky label method for the fan light above the door. With both sets of windows done, I used PVA glue to attach the front to the rear. Some clips held it all in place whilst the glue went off. Before adding the sides, I colour the exposed paper edges with warm grey watercolour pencil, so that when the sides drop on, the edges are crisp and don't have a bright white edge. Oops, I forgot about the bits that stick out. With a little hole cut, the sides drop on with Oohoo. I use Weetabix card for the stone details. It's thin and really sturdy. It's ideal for cutting out these thin, intricate elements. I build them all up in layers. I use the watercolour pencil to colour the edges, and I drop them into place with PVA glue. The stone trim around the ventilation tunnels are cut from Weetabix packet. I crisscross the hole, and then cut away the wedges. Finally, I drop it into place with PVA glue. I chose 1859 for the date stone, making this one of the older die drying works. With the inside and the border printed separately, I roughly cut them out, and I glued them onto another piece of paper. And again, they are now 3 layers thick. With this done, I carefully cut away the inside of the border, and then coloured the edges with a pencil. This is roughly cut out and glued on top of the inside part. Once the glue is completely dry, I then cut around the whole thing, and I colour the edges with the watercolour pencil. This gives a lovely solid looking stone with an embossed edge that's only 0.5mm wide. I used Scale Scene's slate roof tiles for my roof, arranged on a small piece of Weetabix card. Adrian used a different technique for his roof. With thin strips of card across the roof piece, he then placed toilet paper on top with diluted PVA. This spreads into the tissue and makes a great weathered asphalt roof, especially when painted with watercolours. Back to my die drying works, I added a Weetabix packet fascia with PVA and Weetabix packet downspouts. The grand Victorian staircase was just a pile of card glued together with PVA, and then painted with a stone-coloured acrylic paint. I had a lot of fun with the Save Our Works banner. I downloaded a banner image, and then arranged text along a path in Inkscape. I added shading and blending to match the shadows and highlights on the banner, and it's led to a really effective look of a banner held taut at the corners. This was placed onto the building with PVA. Now, no fundraising project in the 90s would be complete without a NAF thermometer counting up to the unobtainable goal. This was added in the same way. I think that the thermometer being completely empty is very fitting to the Chandwell aesthetic. But maybe, just maybe, an appeal from Chandwell's favourite celebrity Britney Scroggins might help that thermometer get filled up a little bit.
Die drying works were once a common sight across Yorkshire, but sadly the one next to the Chander is the only one remaining in England. After a period as an electrical workshop in the 60s, it has now fallen into terrible disrepair. Please donate generously so that we can save this beautiful building. It truly is one of a kind. We are just dying to save our die drying works.
I use AK Interactive matte varnish to protect the building. In the second coat, I add watery watercolour paint to add weathering to the building. In the end, it's time to glue the cassette to the plinth I made. Next time I'm asked, Michael, what's the best way to glue an old music cassette to a card base? Then I will definitely say Oohoo. A final coat of AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish completes the build, and the flat finish, combined with the way it subtly fills in any gaps, leaves a solid looking building that is an almost exact representation of its prototype, I hope. You'll notice that I've not added any chimney pots. I agonised for ages trying to work out whether these columns were chimneys, or whether they were just pedestals for some kind of long gone ornamentation. Sadly, I can't tell one way or another. We simply don't know much about these die drying works. The etching in the engineer does not have chimney pots, although it's ambiguous whether this smoke here is coming from the die drying works or a mill in the distance. It's really sad that we don't know much about the dye drying works. I didn't even know what to put inside the ventilation tunnels. Did they have fan blades in there, some kind of shutters? Did little urchins work in there, keeping the mechanics turning? We just don't know. I hope I've inspired you to use junk from around your own house to make the more difficult buildings that you wouldn't really know where to start with otherwise. Maybe if you're modelling 00, you could make your own dye drying works, maybe use an old Betamax video cassette or something. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have, please do give it a thumbs up. It encourages me to keep making models and keep making videos. But please, more important than that, if you have any information on the dye drying works, please do add it into the comments. These fascinating buildings that everyone seems to have forgotten about and lost in history, I'd love to hear more about them, so if you do have any information, please do add it in the comments. Adrian is also interested to hear anything you might know about the old LNWR turntable observation towers. He had to put brick feet on the stanchions to keep it level, and he doesn't know if that was prototypical or not. So, enough of this nonsense. I promise that next week things will get back to normal. So until then, thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.